Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Today, we're going to be talking about statistics and numbers, be it the last Frenchman who won a Grand Prix or the customary George Russell statistic, being him beating his teammate for the nth time. There's always someone who's required to do all the hard work behind the scenes to give us all these fascinating stats and numbers. And today, I have with me someone who's been doing it for the last 2 decades. I have with me Sean Kelly, also known as the virtual Statman on the social world. Thank you, Sean, for joining us.
No
How are you
problem.
doing?
It's a pleasure. It's all good here. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. All right. So before we jump into things, I would like to tell our audience that during the course of the interview, I'll be peppering a few weird and interesting stats throughout it. So stay tuned for that. All right. So Sean, so why don't you go ahead and tell our viewers and listeners what exactly do you do in the world of motorsport, especially in Formula One?
Well, in short, when you hear a stat on the air or a nugget of information, a number, factoid, historical information, usually I'm the source of that. I'm the person who has to come up with that stuff. That entails writing a lot of stuff in advance, prepping each broadcast, things that we know we're going to need. For instance, what's Lewis Hamilton what record is he likely to break this weekend? Because every race he has a record he's going to break, it seems. More nuanced stuff about the history of the racetrack, what's happened on this date in history, all things like that. When the cars are not on the track, and I'm not doing that for the broadcasters, both prepping it and then doing it live through a service they can access in the commentary boxes. I'm entertaining the guests in a normal world, a non-coronavirus world. I'd be at the racetrack entertaining guests with Formula One experiences and with the Formula One Paddock Club, and also some bits and pieces with Shell lately, which they entertain the guests for Ferrari. So there's quite a full quota of things there. If you buy an official F1 race program, you'll see my numbers in there as well.
Wow.
So yeah, you're stuck with me basically. Even if you try and avoid me, you can't get away from it. So I'm going to bombard you with numbers one way or another.
I'm all for that. I totally love statistics and seeing them, turning up on the display of the broadcast it's a nice addition to the whole broadcast. So Sean, so how were your early days as an F1 fan, and how did this interest towards statistics and numbers and patterns, how did it come about?
Well, I started watching Formula One in 1987 when I was 6 years old, and it was an accident actually how I started, because my big brother was in charge of the remote control for the television, and he decreed that our entertainment for this evening was the 1987 Brazilian Grand Prix. Never seen a race in my life before up to that point, and I thought, oh, look, all these wonderful, colourful cars that make lots of noise. It's very interesting. I find that interesting. I'd like to watch another one. And yeah, it was a total fluke. After that, I just kept on watching the races, and from that day forth, from the start of that was the first race in 1987. I've only missed 2 races since then, and none for
Wow.
28 years. So it just the way it went. I didn't make a conscious decision. I wasn't from a racing family. None of my parents weren't in racing or anything like that. It was just something I looked at and thought, oh, that's interesting. I'll follow that. And from there, of course, I never, like many people, I wanted to be a driver. But what I was really good at was absorbing the information from these races. And I thought everybody else was taking it in to the same nerdy level that I was. And it was only when I got to be a teenager or so I realized, no, not really. People are not studying this in the detail that you are, or at least they're not retaining the information in the way that I was. And my mum said that I should do something with that skill, and I used to go, yeah, right. Like anybody ever makes any money doing that? And eventually, I had the sort of push factor to think, well, let's see if I can. So at the end of 2002, I had an American girlfriend at the time. I called the American broadcaster at the time, which was Speed Channel, cold called them, didn't know anyone there, left them a voicemail message along the lines of, it'd be a much better show if you hired me. And to my astonishment, they actually called me back 3 days later and said, I'm sorry, what was it that you wanted? So I explained to them rather nervously, and they said, okay, well, I'll tell you what, why don't you send us an example and we'll take a look at it. Okay, yeah, no problem. No idea what I'm supposed to prepare. I have no prior experience in actually doing this job. So I did that. sent it in, and then I said to them, could you send me what you've been using up to now? So they did. They faxed it to me. That's how long ago it was. They used the fax machine to send this thing to me in the end of 2002. And I went through it with a Sharpie and, put corrections on it and faxed it back to them an hour later. Said, this is a mistake. This is factually inaccurate. This is misleading. Change this. Like a teacher marking a student's paper. And after that, they decided, okay, we'll take you. And they paid me $200 a race in 2003.
Wow.
There was 16 races in 2003, and they paid me $200 a race. And I thought, yeah, all right.
It's not bad.
I mean, that's
It's not bad.
$200. That's $200 more than I was getting before, and I'd still be watching it. Now I'm getting paid to watch it. No one can tell me. No one can emotionally blackmail me now and say, you can't watch this. Come out with us. No, I'm working. So that's how it started. And then there was no. I didn't really have any idea that it was going to be a career at the time. That didn't come until like halfway through the first season, when I thought, well, it looks like I'm going to be doing it again next year.
No, that's very niche skill to have, and I've heard of this cold calling episode, and you've mentioned it a couple of times before as well. I think it's absolutely funny, just calling the broadcaster or the network and telling them that I'm the guy for that you need.
Well, the funny thing about that, sorry to interrupt, the person who called me back was Frank Wilson, who was the executive producer, essentially, for the broadcast, who has gone on to be a career mentor of mine. We're still very good friends. We still talk all the time. And it's funny, initially he was sort of hiring me just to get me to shut up. Like, stop calling me. If I give you a job, will you stop calling me? Sure, yes, absolutely. And we've stayed friends ever since. He was, he actually, I still do work for him doing Formula E as well, because I also do that series for Fox Sports. So it is a working relationship that has endured right from the very first day I worked in Formula One.
Wow, that sounds amazing. So what do you think about numbers? Because in my opinion, numbers of finding statistics or patterns, it's also complex while it's also very simple, because the data doesn't speak for itself. You have a lot of numbers, you have a lot of different patterns, but you have to identify them manually. No one's going to do it for you. Neither can a machine do it for you. So it's very complex finding out those different statistics that you mentioned. But then it's also simple in the way that you have to present it in at most 1 or 2 sentences so that people can consume it very easily, and it all makes sense. So I think it's a mixture of complex and simple. So what do you think about all the numbers that you find?
Well, as I always tell every broadcaster, I could give you a preview pack for the race that's 100 pages long, but it really wouldn't be of any use to you, because you're not going to read 100 pages worth of this stuff, nor would you ever use 100 pages of it in a broadcast. What's imperative, and this is much more important with a TV broadcast than if you were doing analysis on a nuanced Formula One oriented website where you've got a market just of the really hardcore fans. With a TV broadcast, you've got to think to yourself, it must appeal to somebody who doesn't usually watch Formula One. They've got to be able to understand this too. So right. In my case, it's imperative that no matter how far we drill down into the numbers, it must be something you can understand in a sentence. Like you can't have this run-on paragraph like, so, this is only the 4th time that this car has done this with a driver from this country since 1973 on this tire brand. Like, you've lost everybody. No one cares. It has to be something more straightforward, much. Lewis Hamilton's helping me out right now by breaking all of these all-time records. Very, very straightforward. Okay, he's got the most wins in Formula One history. Anyone can understand that. Most pole positions in Formula One history. Anyone can understand that. It's the 1000th World Championship event. Everyone gets it. So it's those things. In a TV broadcast, you've got to boil it down to just that. It's simplicity. It is, as you mentioned, it's quite painstaking to find all this stuff. And people think that I have these algorithms and complex databases to do this for me. And I don't. I actually sit there for, maybe 20 hours or so before each race. That's how many hours of work it is to get a race weekend together in advance, not including the race weekend itself. So you sit there and you painstakingly go through it and you find patterns and you think, oh, that's interesting. Let me throw that in. And you get these things that an algorithm, a program would not spit out because it doesn't understand the context of things properly. So that's probably why I've become quite in demand, I think, because I kind of err on the side of simplicity, and you've got to keep it simple. As I said, it could be PhD level mathematics, but you're only people with a PhD will understand it, and 99% of people do not have that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, it's time for a little stats break for our audience. So the 1975 and the 1982 Swiss Grand Prix were held in France, while the 1997 and 1998 Luxembourg Grand Prix were held in Germany at the Nürburgring. Kind of odd, isn't it, having the title of a different country and hosting the race in a different country altogether?
Yeah,
All right.
absolutely. Flag of convenience, as we called them. And they weren't the only ones, of course. Where we were at Imola, that used to be the San Marino Grand Prix. That was another flag of convenience.
Is it?
Yeah, absolutely. From 1981 to 2006, it was the San Marino Grand Prix, not in San Marino.
Okay. I didn't know that. I did not know that. Thanks for that, Sean. All right. So what's your typical race weekend like? And before you answer this, I really want to know how chaotic was the 2019 German Grand Prix, that wet Hockenheim race, and also the 2020 Italian Grand Prix at Monza.
Well, those races actually weren't too bad. They're actually quite fun races to do because you've got unexpected developments. And, when Lewis Hamilton's just going round and round in the lead and stuff, you can kind of telegraph what's happening. You can say, well, he's going to win this race and then he's going to have the all-time wins record. And you can kind of see it from an hour away. What's more fun is when you have these unexpected races like Hockenheim last year that you mentioned, like Monza this year, when suddenly there's an unexpected event where you think, oh, wait a minute, this hasn't happened since when? Okay, why is this important? Why do we need to know this? What can you get out on the air now? And that's really exciting because it wasn't like this at the start of my career, but nowadays you're almost, my job is to beat Twitter. That's basically what my job is. I need to be quicker and more accurate than Twitter because Twitter is a free information service now. So you could collate stuff from there. But when you have these unexpected events, that's when you really get them, that's when you earn your money. What does a typical race weekend look like? Well, as I mentioned, a lot of the research is done in advance. For instance, this weekend is Istanbul, and the Istanbul notes are done. They're already done. They're out. The broadcasters will be picking through what they want to do. Commentators will be thinking, yes, I definitely want to mention this on Friday. I want to mention this on Sunday, whatever they want to do. When we get into a race weekend, Friday is actually a really easy day for me because there's nothing I can add in Friday practice because, there wasn't a Thursday practice. So I can't say, well, based on yesterday, it went like this. And anything that I could add is already in the pack that I gave them. So it's just read that. Fridays, I should differentiate, by the way, that there is a Friday in a normal world and the Friday in the 2020 season with the coronavirus world. Because these days I present for the Virtual Paddock Club, which is done via Zoom. So we rehearsed that after free practice 2. If it was a normal race, if it was a non-coronavirus race, I'd be doing the Friday Night Insider in the pit lane live, usually in front of one of the garages. And we have people who sign up for the F1 Experiences package, not to sound like I'm promoting a product here for you. If you're one of those guests, then, come down, get a glass of champagne, roam around the paddock club, come up and down the pit lane privately. You get, personalized tour. You get me droning on at you. You get Bernd Mailander showing you the safety car, which is far more exciting. You get, some of the teams will bring out a front wing for you to have a look at and all that stuff.
Now, those honestly were quite simply some amazing stories, weren't they? Well, there's more of that coming up soon. So after this very short message, we're going to have Sean Kelly coming up and sharing more of his fascinating stories. But if you're wondering, how can I do a job similar to what Sean Kelly is doing at this stage? And how can I be a top-line F1 Statsman? Well, stay tuned on the Pits To Podium website. We're going to have a written feature coming up very, very soon over there with Sundaram, who's hosted this video, coming up with that feature. And if you're going on the website, don't forget, you can check out our Pits To Podium stats section, where Sundaram has also come up with some fascinating stats that you can check out and honestly be amazed. Now then, back to the video.
So let's move to the next question. So what are your three favorite statistics? And are there any particular numbers or stats that have not gotten the type of acclaim that they should have?
Well, my personal favorite statistic in my career comes from Monza 2003, which was my first year in F1. And I was very lucky to start Formula One in '03, because had I started in '02, it was a really boring year, because Schumacher won 11 races and had the championship wrapped up in the middle of July. It was it was a year to forget, really. But in '03, we had a crazy year when there was the breakout year for Kimi Raikkonen and Fernando Alonso, and we had a lot of things happen that had really redrew the Formula One record books. The main one being Monza '03, which is a record that still stands, the fastest Grand Prix in Formula One history, just under 154 miles per hour. Forgive me if I can't remember what that is in kilometers an hour. But I was only working for Speed Channel in 2003 in the United States. And this was before we had this streamlined service where, you can have stuff accessible in the booth and all that. I would call them from my house, as soon as the race was ending, and tell them, the aforementioned Frank Wilson, the person who had first hired me, and tell him, Frank, it's this, 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 and this. And he'd write it down, and he'd pass it on to the commentators. Well, that race, as I mentioned, it was the fastest race in Formula One history. It broke the record that had stood since 1971. And in advance of the race, I'd calculated the exact time to the thousandth of a second that the race had to stop, had to end for it to be a record. So it did that, and it came in, broke the record, called them up. It's a record, Frank. It's just under 154 miles an hour average, and they went straight out with it before Michael Schumacher even reached Parc Fermé. And then no one else ran it. It was just us. And I thought, in the sort of 18 hours that followed, I thought to myself, I am sure that is right. But why is no one else saying it? How come no one else has noticed this? And it started to get very, very nerve-wracking, because I thought, have I just told us to say we've just broken one of the most significant F1 records of all time? Oh no, wait, sorry, our bad, we haven't. I completely calculated it wrong. And I got to the point where that evening I sent an email out to everybody in production and our on-air commentators and said, look guys, I've calculated this 10 times now, and every time it's correct, but no one else has reported it. And I want you to know, I'm still sure this is right. I just can't work out why no one else has said it, and I'm worried that I'm wrong. Which didn't really help everything, because everybody went, oh, thanks. So is it right or not? I said, I'm sure it's right, but why is no one else talking about it? Now, luckily, the next morning I woke up, and there was on the grandprix.com website, fastest Grand Prix in history. Okay, I can stay. Okay, I've still got a career. But what happened thereafter was, oh wow, this stuff that until now it was like we would have talked about it the next day. We had it up while we were live. So suddenly It was a big jump in my career. 2 weeks later, we were at Indianapolis, on site at Indianapolis for the US Grand Prix. And suddenly, from having been unemployed before the start of that year, suddenly I'm in the restaurant, St. Elmo's in Indianapolis, and Jean Todt and Ross Brawn are over here. And, there's, Fernando Alonso's having dinner over there. I'm like, bloody hell. What's happened? So that might have happened anyway without that stat, but certainly it was a thing where, okay, you keep this guy around, he's quite good. So on a personal level, that's always been my favorite. I'm sure there are quite a few statistics that don't get the traction that they deserve. I confess I can't think of any off the top of my head, but if I cycle through the last 17 years, I guarantee you there are many of them, because I have to come up with thousands upon thousands of these things. One of them you'll hear this weekend, and that is that it's actually the 500th World Championship event for a Sauber-entered car this week. That encompasses Sauber, that encompasses BMW Sauber, and also Alfa Romeo. And the most fascinating part about that is they've started 497. This will be 497 this weekend.
Okay.
Their team manager, Beat Zender, has only missed one session in 27
Wow.
years. One session, not one race, one session. He missed FP1 at Monza in 2008 because he had to go back to Switzerland because of a family emergency. Well, it just so happens, of
Okay.
course, that Monza is quite close to the Swiss border. So he drove there and drove back again for FP2. And that is the only session that he has missed out on in the 27 years that Sauber have had a team in Formula One, which I think is an astonishing statistic. And I hope that that one does get traction this weekend because that's an amazing record to have. So yeah, what was it? Other favourite stats? Well, there's so many to pick from, isn't there?
There's also a Jim Clark one that you particularly like, right?
Oh yes, there is that. Regarding all-time data, the fact that Jim Clark, 72 Grand Prix, 125, finished second once, ever, which, if memory serves me right, was the 1963 German Grand Prix. Jim Clark, if anything sums up Jim Clark, how brilliant he was that invariably the car would win or he would retire. He didn't have much in between. The fact that he had 25 wins, 1 second place. I mean, even Lewis Hamilton doesn't have that. Even he has days when he loses, and not because of the car, not because the car broke down. If Clark's numbers are astonishing, and they're obscured by the fact that he only started 72 World Championship races in an era where we didn't have a lot of World Championship events, but we did have a lot of non-championship Grand Prix. If they had all counted, if they'd all been championship events back then, we would have had a fairer comparison between the greats of each era.
Right. So I've actually read this on a Reddit AMA a few years ago, and I think a lot of us want to know, how do you maintain your database, and how much of effort does it take to input all the details of a particular race after it's done?
Well, as I mentioned, it's usually about 10 to 20 hours of work. There is an argument to say you could do this automatically, and it would save me a lot of time. That's definitely true. What it would also do is rob me of the need to study every single aspect of the numbers.
Right.
And one way or another, you're going to have to sit there and study it. If you want to get the most out of it, you have to study it. So it doesn't really matter. If you had an algorithm that updated everything automatically for you, you'd still have to sit there for just the same amount of time and figure it all out. So the fact that you have to sit there and actually work the numbers and think, that's interesting. The way that's come together reminds me of another pattern from the 2004 season. That's knowledge that you wouldn't have if you had a machine to do it for you. It can be quite painstaking. It can be quite annoying. And certainly when we have back-to-back race weekends, it can be very, very tight on time. Yeah. But, I mean, there's no other way. Formula One is supposed to be... You're supposed to be the best in your job if you're working in Formula One, whether you're the person who sweeps the floor or whether you're the person who drives the car. So, as I tend to remind myself fairly regularly in these times, they can find someone else to do this. If you really don't want to do this, I'm sure there's plenty of other people who'd be more than happy to stand in for you.
Absolutely. All right, it's time for yet another stats break. So, since the start of 2015, the driver who has the most number of race retirements is my favorite driver, Fernando Alonso, with 30 DNFs. Even though he's not been in the sport for the last 2 years. You then have Nico Hülkenberg, you have Carlos Sainz, and then you have a very familiar name, Romain Grosjean. You expect him to be probably topping the list, but unfortunately it isn't. And then you have Max Verstappen. And talking also about retirements, amongst drivers who have completed at least one season in the sport, Valtteri Bottas has the smallest race retirement percentage of 8.55. He basically retires once in 8 or 9 races, which goes on to show how consistent and reliable he's been, and followed by Alex Albon and Lewis Hamilton. And Bottas has never had a first lap retirement ever. So this is pretty interesting, I would say.
Yeah, we actually ran that stat a few weeks ago in a different race. I remember putting it in
really?
the pack that Bottas has never been out on the first lap. I can't remember which race it was exactly, but yeah, I remember writing that one. But I didn't know who had the most retirements since 2015, so you just taught me something.
Now, that was quite a fun one, wasn't it? I genuinely loved watching the video all the way through, and it just feels so natural and feels so good to see someone with such a great love for the sport and statistics come out there and share all these beautiful stories and with such charisma as well. I loved watching it. And I hope you did as well. That was our latest Pitch to Podium special. If you like stats, which I'm pretty sure that you do, we also have a stats section on the Pitch to Podium website with Sundaram, who hosted this video, coming up with some mind blowing stats and figures about Formula One, the races, the drivers, the tracks, all on the Pitch to Podium website. And if you enjoyed this conversation, which I'm pretty sure you did, this isn't it. We are having more really fun bits of the conversation up on the Pitch to Podium website coming up in our latest written feature. That's going to be up soon. For that, you want to stay tuned. Follow Pitch to Podium on YouTube and all our social media links, all of which are down below. And don't forget to check the Pitch to Podium website. Thank you so much for watching, folks, and see you on another Pitch to Podium special.